Hello, good morning everyone, and welcome to session 2 of the Philippine Korean Studies Symposium. I'm Mark Isla, the moderator for this session. So while you're enjoying your snacks, we'll be introducing our speakers. So for this panel, we have 3 speakers. Emil Mia Damian from Foreign Service Institute. And also we have Fitzgerald Bulawan from UP Tacloban College. Accent Fitzgerald Bulawan. And then the last presenter would be Mr. Joshua Emmanuel Ramos from the House of Representatives of the Philippines. So we're going to start with Emil Mia Damian from Foreign Service Institute.
Also, good morning everyone. First of all, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Kyung Min Baek and the UPKRC for giving me the invitation to write something about the Philippines in Korea, and to have the opportunity to share this today. So, for introduction or background, the Philippines and the Republic of Korea reached a milestone year in diplomatic relations as 2024 there. 2024 marked the 75th year of the state's bilateral relations. On the occasion of the said milestone anniversary, leaders of the two countries agreed on the elevation of bilateral relations to strategic partnership, entailing intensified cooperation between coast guards and a greater focus on tourism, supply chains, and nuclear energy, among others. However, this paper argues that the picture of mutual understanding between the two countries is incomplete with only narratives of development at the state level. Complementing the development of diplomatic relations at the state level are subnational advances that pursue goodwill and international understanding. Para-diplomatic efforts have also emerged alongside formal diplomatic activities, contributing to closer people relations and beneficial small-scale exchanges. So the joint declaration on the strategic partnership between the Republic of Korea and the Republic of the Philippines actually mentions that strong people-to-people exchanges are a meaningful anchor of the Philippines and Korea's bilateral relations. The two countries will aim to foster even greater appreciation, understanding, and interaction among their peoples through continued safe and secure travels and tourism flows, increased cooperation in educational and human resource development, including technical and vocational education training, and the upskilling of human resources for the digital age, and other exchanges at the national and local levels, including sisterhood or twinning agreements among local government units subject to laws, rules, and domestic regulations. This entails that the elevation of relations to strategic partnership means not only intensifying cooperation in areas of national scope and concern, but also deepening engagement through localized and people-to-people engagement. While the strategic partnership is meant to guide the country's relations moving forward, para-diplomacy, which includes sisterhood agreements, has been ongoing for some time, as our diplomacy activities can be a strategic step in promoting an area, and in countries with a strategic region and a geographic, cultural, and demographic context, the practice of para-diplomacy will be more effective. In the Philippines, the city of Baguio has 3 sister cities from the Republic of Korea, namely Quebec City, Gongjo City, and Yeonsu District in Incheon. These less bureaucratically complicated city-sisterhood relations have yielded engagements focused on people-to-people interactions and understanding. But before elaborating on the experiences and activities of Baguio with its Korean sister cities, I wish to briefly provide the definition and status of scholarship on paradiplomacy. It is a contested concept, especially in relation to the state, central state, and its official diplomatic function. However, in this research, it is meant to refer to international actions by non-central governments or subnational state actors. It is employed as a descriptive term. It is an umbrella term covering city diplomacy, which manifests in sister city relations in one way. There is now a great diffusion of works on paradiplomacy globally, but not much in the Philippines, and often without an agreed theory or methodology. The most influential works were more descriptive than explanatory in content, usually just in the form of case studies, because of the lack of an accepted theoretical framework that can fully explain the diverse motivations, strategies, and impacts of sub-state actors in international politics. It is said that paradiplomacy cannot really explain. Nonetheless, it has to be explained because studies of the emergence of new international actors are fundamental, since without them, it is difficult to give a complete picture of the international situation. As an empirical phenomenon, the practice of paradiplomacy depends on both internal and external factors, and motivations for engaging internationally can be economically, culturally, or politically informed. Much like the existing studies on paradiplomacy, this research is a qualitative descriptive study employing a historical inquiry approach. For the methodology, I used document analysis of primary sources, including letters between the city mayors, city resolutions, memoranda, and agreements, and secondary sources, including news reports and other relevant publications. This research aims to provide an answer to, first, what uniquely enabled Baguio to strategically connect through sister city agreements. Second, when did Baguio have sister cities from Korea, and how is the emergence of these sister cities relations fit in the broader history of Philippine-Korea diplomatic relations? And lastly, what areas of cooperation and activities have been pursued in these sister city agreements? For backdrop, the international reach of the city of Baguio through the mechanism of forging sisterhood agreements was not an independent or autonomous event unfolding in the open, or it's not a sudden disruption or anomaly emerging in a historical void. Prior to engaging through sister city agreements, Baguio has already reached a degree of internationalization, being a colonial creation during the American occupation in the early days, which is also related to its entanglement with the Japanese in the Second World War. Historically, there are two dominating narratives on the post-war emergence of city sisterhood ventures. These are the European model immediately after the Second World War and the American model during the period of the Cold War. The European model was regarded as a reconciliatory move, while the goals of the latter, American model, during the Cold War were much more contentious. Concerning the temporal dimension, Baguio's sister city relations started emerging after the Second World War as well as during the Cold War. Its first sister city agreement was with Japan in 1969. Then it had attempts to build sister city agreements with China, United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The fact that Baguio's sister cities were established at times encompassing both milieux after the Second World War and during the Cold War points to the conclusion that the city was integrated to the nascent global trend of forging sister cities. Available records show that the earliest attempt of Baguio to form sister city relations with Korea happened in 1981, when Baguio City Mayor Ernesto Bueno presented the sisterhood proposal to the Philippine ambassador to South Korea, Nicanor Jimenez, during the latter's brief visit to the city, although it did not result to fruition. This table summarizes the local or subnational units which Baguio attempted to build sisterhood agreements with, but only Tebek, those that are shaded, Tebek, Gokju, and Yunsu have finalized MOU for sister or friendly city relations. The ceremonial exchanges between Baguio and the cities are quite active until now, with almost yearly visits, especially to attend local festivals and offer cultural or traditional presentations, and other activities will be discussed in the next slides. For Baguio's first active sister city from Korea, the Memorandum of Agreement for Sisterhood Relations was signed only in 2005, when delegates from Tebek, headed by the city mayor, visited the city. The motivations were said to be similar qualities and opportunities as to education, environment preservation endeavors, and tourism. The city sisterhood tie-up have been perceived by the local chief executives of both cities to pave the way to the exploration of imaginative avenues through the sharing of technological, legislative, executive, administrative, and economic development activities unique to each LGU, geared towards their mutual growth. A year after the signing of the MOU in 2006, an agreement on reciprocal exchange of government employees was signed. This reciprocal government employee exchange characterized the activity of the two cities from 2009 until 2018. According to available records and news reports, I think it was disrupted during the time of the pandemic, and they are trying to reintegrate it now. The two cities are also now working to expand areas of cooperation in education, as a memorandum of understanding was signed last year with the University of Baguio, the University of Cordilleras, and St. Louis University. The partnership between the local government units of Baguio and Tebek with the higher educational institutions is particularly aimed at improving international understanding and enhancing the development of joint educational research projects that are relevant to the needs of the cities, among others, through student and professional exchanges. Also, this is a recent development. There was an agreement for a seasonal worker program in agriculture, and the city government of Baguio has already started the selection process for farmers just last February. However, the city government is seen to be careful with this venture because of current issues surrounding the seasonal worker program in other localities in the Philippines. A committee was formed to oversee this project. For Baguio City and Gwangju, this is the second city, initiations for forging of sister city relationship emerged in 2009 after a recommendation coming from Philippine Sisterhood and Twinning Association, or Baguio, a chapter in Baguio City. The relationship particularly states that the motivation for entry into the relationship was due to great potential endeavors in terms of formal exchange in the field of education, where effective reciprocal agreements between students and curriculum may be possible for the effective promotion of Baguio as educational capital of the North. The MOU for this agreement was finalized in 2011. And so far, this relationship resulted in the donation of computer units for use of public school students and scholarship for deserving students at the Baguio City National High School. Gwangju and other international sister cities were also instrumental in the beautification of the Sister Cities Park located at the Baguio Botanical Garden. And then next, Baguio's sister city relations with another unit in Korea, Yunsu District in Incheon, is still less than 10 years old. The agreement for friendly exchange having been signed only in December of 2015, which explains the which explains the limited activities between the cities so far. In 2017, 20 students from Yeonsu participated in a student exchange program where several officials and other local residents acted as their poster parents. In 2023, potential cooperation in education were explored as a delegation from Yeonsu visited Brent International School in Baguio. For the preliminary findings, analysis, and emerging themes, Baguio City has strategically entered into sister city agreements to pursue various forms of cooperation and exchange with other subnational government units. Noting that the city's very first sister city agreement was forged in 1969 with Hanyu, Japan, its productive or active sister city relations with Korean sister cities were only recent developments, beginning only in 2005. So that's a long period, 1969 for Japan and Korea, 2005. The emergence of Baguio's Korean sister cities only at that time may be supported by the lack of prior historically significant connection that could propel interactions compared, for example, to Japan and the United States. The noticeable migration of Koreans in Baguio during the 2000s can be attributed not just to the climate, but also because they found Baguio a suitable place to study English at local universities because the cost is relatively low. And Baguio's being a university town later on in time, it became a significant pull factor to what Paris called the Koreanization of Baguio City, which may be influential to the rise of the sister cities during the period. However, these more recent sororal ties with Korean government units with a span of just 20 years are evidently greater in number and expanding in terms of areas of activities and cooperation. If compared to the sister cities from other countries, I think Baguio now maintains just one sister city relations with Japan as of now, and I think one active also from the United States. So three compared to one. The sister city the areas of cooperation in these kind of relationships, I mean sister city relations, the areas of cooperation already covered cultural, economic, educational, and technical administrative exchanges. These are non-sensitive policy areas that official diplomatic institutions can support to augment and strengthen public and cultural diplomacy efforts as the Philippines and Korea's bilateral relations move forward. So my presentation ends here. Thank you for listening. Pero juicioso ang sa kanila.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nia, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the next presenter would be Axel Fitzgerald Bulawan from the UP Diploma College.
Okay, hello, good morning everyone. I am Axel, an instructor of economics from the University of the Philippines Diploma College. I am pleased to present my preliminary findings from a paper that I am currently writing about the South Korea-Philippines Free Trade Agreement. But before that, I want to thank the UP Korea Research Center through the leadership of Doc Mia for allowing me to present to this symposium. The Korea Research Center has not only been tapping me personally, but also we've been partnering with the Korea Research Center for hosting webinars. In fact, last week we just held our webinar online. So we are happy to be a continued part of DRC's programs. Okay. So my presentation will proceed as follows. First, I would talk about the background about the Philippine-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, or FTA, and the impetus for my research. Next, I'll talk about the history of the South Korea and Philippine diplomatic and economic relations a bit that led to the signing of the FTA. And then afterwards, I'll talk more briefly about the framework that I use in analyzing the FTA. After which, I'll talk about the FTA through basically that analytical framework, mainly structured around the possible opportunities and underlying risks and factors that could inhibit both countries from achieving what they intend to with the FTA. Finally, I'll make conclusions about the opportunities and risks that is brought about by the FTA. Okay, so for the information of everybody who don't know already, the Philippines-Korea Free Trade Agreement was signed on September of 2023 at the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit and took effect on the December of 31st of 2024. It is the first of FTA, the third FTA of the Philippines after Japan, which was our first, and the second was with the EU. We would assume that the Philippines had a lot of FTA already, but I was surprised to learn that it's actually the third. In comparison, however, this is South Korea's multiple FTAs. In fact, this is the fifth FTA of South Korea for ASEAN, for just the ASEAN region. And that's even after the fact that South Korea already has an FTA with the ASEAN itself. So there's high hope for the FTA. It started with the Duterte administration, carried over by the Marcos Jr. administration. Marcos himself had high praises for the FTA. At its signing, he said that the FTA will strengthen the bilateral trade and investment relations with the Republic of Korea. So there's really excitement with the FTA and its promise for economic prospects, not just for the Philippines, but also for South Korea. Okay, now why study this? In economics, there's generally a consensus over the overall positive effects of increased trade. It's one of the principles or the main maxims of economics, and when they teach in for economics, that trade is actually a good thing because it makes everyone better off, contrary to common perception by the public. It's commonly a response to the natural tendencies of protectionism by countries. The argument goes that it's a good thing because it allows for the nature of comparative advantage allows for countries to specialize in producing goods that they have comparative advantage on. The specializations allow them to produce more goods than otherwise if they had not traded in the first place. That's the nature of the common prevailing argument. But according to Roderick, the nature of FTAs in the modern times have changed. It does not only reduce trade barriers by eliminating trades through the elimination or reduction of tariffs and import quotas and whatever trade restrictions there are, but it has expanded in such a way that there are regulations involved intellectual property, partnerships, and that's actually what's present also in the FTA we have with South Korea. According to this argument, there should be more nuances as to the effect of FTAs. It should not be a guaranteed thing that it is beneficial for both countries, especially that there are distributional consequences. So even if there's a general consensus in economics that FTA might be beneficial in a general sense, there should be an analysis or at least a primary impact evaluation to really assess what the benefits are, who's stand to benefit more, for example, and why, for instance, if it does exist, why is there a parity of the benefits? So that's some of the questions of this research. Okay. So the signing of the FTA coincides, as mentioned earlier, with the 75th anniversary that is being celebrated of diplomatic relationship between South Korea and the Philippines. The Philippines is the first country to have a diplomatic relationship with South Korea's ASEAN countries, starting from 1949. Again, as mentioned earlier, this is the Philippines' third FTA after Japan and EU. Meanwhile, this is South Korea's fifth FTA for ASEAN. So there's actually a trend for South Korea to increase their trade by signing FTAs with other countries, especially because a lot of their economy relies on international trade relative to the Philippines, whereby our economy is largely consumption driven. South Korea ranks fifth among the Philippines' top trading partners. It's fifth for exports and fourth for imports. So South Korea is the top fifth country we export our goods and services to, and is the fourth source for our imports. But when you compare that to South Korean exports to the Philippines, we're quite low. We're the 12th destination for their exports, and the overall Korean-Philippine trade in 2023 is valued at $12 billion. Okay, so given that economic history, it was signed, the FTA was signed on the September of 17th, and it took effect a year and a quarter after on December of 31, just last year. So we're just 4 months into the FTA. So the goal of the FTA, just like any other FTAs, is to primarily boost trade activities between the two countries. That's done by eliminating trade barriers, primarily tariff. Tariff are basically taxes, taxes to countries who are exporting to our country. So for example, South Korea is exporting electronic goods. There's a tariff on that. Automotive cars, for example, if they're exporting cars, there's a tariff on that in the Philippines. So if the intent is to increase trade activity between those two countries, to reduce the tariff or eliminate it completely, so as to reduce the price, kasi it's thought of as a price. If you reduce the tax, you reduce the price in the domestic market, and hopefully you see an uptick in the consumption of those goods, increasing trade activity. So that's just one. There are other trade restrictions, import quotas, for example. So that's the primary goal of the FTA. But aside from that, there are other goals of the FTAs, and that's actually how I wanted to assess the Philippine-South Korea Free Trade Agreement through its stated goals, from trade activity to investment, economic development, and diplomatic and economic cooperation. So aside from trade activity, I wanted to look at the investment. Investment being, as mentioned earlier, South Korea is one of the top sources of FDIs, foreign direct investments, for the Philippines. So we wanted to look at that. Next, we also want to look at trade activity, how trade and activity and investment translates into economic development. So not just growth in GDP, but translate to reductions in poverty, in inequality in the Philippines. Okay. So a question also we asked is how it would result to structural transformation, for example, or how it would change or alter the choice, the location, and the process to produce goods and services in the country. Because of increased trade, how does it increase the production of trade relative to other goods? And is there a substituting effect? So that's some of the questions I asked in the tenet. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, it's quoted from Danny Roderick, FTAs now in modern times means so much more than reducing trade barriers. It's also now become a sign of increased diplomatic and economic relations and partnership between two countries. It's a show of goodwill for two countries that are part of the FTA. So we want to assess how that has affected the connectivity and partnership between the two countries, especially as part of ASEAN's goal of greater connectivity. Okay, so let's go towards increased trade activity. The FTA's reduction and or elimination of trade barriers really point towards increased trade activity between two countries, as suggested also by the economic literature. In that tenet, there is really a sense that trade is actually going to expand. In fact, there has been already been studies on the FTAs with our FTAs with Japan and EU, saying that it did boost trade activity between countries, and so does that happen with studies analyzing South Korea's FTAs with other countries, including the ASEAN countries. So that tracks well with the main intended goal of the FTA. So even if you read, for example, news articles about the FTA, there's reports about its it would increase the exports of, for example, yung medyo matunog is yung banana production, processed pineapple production. And additionally, there's expected increase in imports for South Korean goods, mainly the mga automated vehicles, parts and components, and especially for commercial passengers and transport vehicles. The point being here is that there's no doubt that the FTA will actually achieve that goal on that front. So again, the idea is that it would really increase trade activities, but that's a given. But the question remains is what are the distributional effects? Given that trade activity increase is given, what the question remains is who would benefit more from the FTA? If you look, for example, at the most common thing, more on yung tinitrade natin is agricultural goods. Meanwhile, yung most of traded goods from South Korea are high value products. So that's the question, especially given that for example, also the reports say that yung implementation natin is tariff reduction or elimination. However, mostly yung sa South Korean side, it's preferential duty-free entry. So of course, that could just be those could just be a result of the relative advanced economy of South Korea, or the fact that the country relies more on trade for its economy relative to the Philippines. But that is something that we need to explore as well. Okay, on the investment side, there's a provision. The Philippine Board of Investment actually projects that the FTA will bring about 150 to 200 billion peso worth in investment in the Philippines. As I mentioned earlier, South Korea is one of the top countries where we source our foreign direct investments. If you see in the table, it's actually in the last quarter of 2024. It's actually the second country after Switzerland. So it tracks well with the intent really of the Philippines bringing in infused capital earlier in presidency of Marcos Jr. This includes, for example, the many attempts to change the constitution of the Philippines to make certain industries liberalized, although if the intent really is economic liberalization or there's a hidden agenda, that's another discussion. And there's a provision in the FDA for investment promotion and industrial development for selected sectors. So it talks about the development part as well. So there are rules for the FDA, but that remains to be seen. The actual effects to countries depends, for example, the willingness of both countries, the competitiveness of the Philippines, and especially if power changes between the two countries. So on the question of economic development, whether the FTA will bring about real development depends on the following factors. The hypothesized location, for example, depends on where the top most exported products are located. So given that most of the production by the Philippines exported to South Korea were bananas, maybe you would see more development to communities where they produce those kinds of goods. Okay. Also, there's the comparative advantage of production of the goods relative to other ASEAN countries. Given that South Korea has free trade agreements with other ASEAN countries, Philippine products are competing with other ASEAN countries, so it has to compete with other ASEAN countries in terms of how much is going to be exported from the Philippines because they might be producing the same stuff, like, for example, rice. So again, there must be enough follow-through to implement provisions on investment and development in the FTA, and also whether or not trade activity would bring about structural transformation in these industries and the labor market. So the hope is that the increased trade activity in that there will be increased production, not to increase the dependence of those communities on the production of those goods. So for example, in the case of bananas, we don't just want to produce bananas all the time. There's nothing wrong with producing banana, but we want those communities to produce banana to have sufficient income in order for them to invest in themselves and diversify to other sectors. So we want FTA not in itself, but as a means to an end, which the end being economic development. We want them to make sure that they're able to bring up development in other areas, sectors such as manufacturing. So that's structural transformation, the shift from agriculture to more high-value products, such that they can bring about fast economic growth and development within the communities. Finally, in terms of economic and diplomatic relations, the FTA actually tracks well with broader ASEAN integration initiatives by enhancing the political and regional supply chains, and it also signifies increased diplomatic and economic relationship between the two countries. I have written elsewhere how South Korea has become the supplier of Philippine naval assets. The corvettes and the frigates of the Philippine Navy has been shipped from South Korea. The FTA is in keeping with South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy released years ago to expand economic connectivity in the region, in line with keeping a free and open Indo-Pacific, something that both countries agree on. Okay, so just in conclusion, while the two countries are really poised to increase trade activity and investment as estimated and predicted, whether those translate to equitable economic development, especially in the regions, and whether it could bring about structural transformation remains to be seen. At this point yet, I think we cannot say because it's too early to tell. It's been just 4 months from the FTA, so we'll have to wait, but we have to be on the lookout for those effects. So if you notice, this paper actually has a lot more questions than answers, questions to think about what could be the possible effects that could be studied in the future. So again, the success of the FTA relies on mitigating several risks, including, for example, competitiveness. We need to ensure that we are competitive, especially relative to other ASEAN neighbors who also have an FTA with South Korea. So you ask, are we competitive? There's some indicators that say we are not, in fact, relative to other ASEAN countries, parang napapag-iwanan na tayo. So in order to take full benefit of the FTA, we need to improve our competitiveness and our business environment. There's also a question about dependency. Maybe the FTA would bring about dependence on Korean import, for example. There's also uncertainty in the global environment, especially recently with the Trump trade tariffs, increase in bilateral trade. So one of the questions we need to ask is how that would affect the trade activity in Korea and the Philippines individually, but also how that would affect the effect of the FTA. And finally, there are internal political risks that have to be mitigated as well, especially, for example, changes in administrations. For example, there's a rift between the Philippine president and vice president, and there's also the recent impeachment of the South Korean president. So there's uncertainty not just in the global environment, but also internally as well. So that ends my presentation. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Axel. Now, our last presenter for this session would be Mr. Joshua Emmanuel Ramos from the House of Representatives.
Good morning to all. I'm honored to present this paper at this conference. I'm very thankful to the UP Korea Research Center and Dr. Bay for this opportunity. So this paper happens to be my thesis for the degree of Master in International Studies. I defended this last year before a panel at the UP Department of Political Science. So this will be the outline of my presentation. I will briefly discuss the background, the problem, what's my main claim, the research question, and the method. But the huge chunk of my time will be devoted to the findings of this study as well as some concluding thoughts. So my study is premised on the view from the literature that the construction of a nation and thereby the construction of national interests is a political and a gendered process. Women's bodies, for instance, are usually made to symbolize a nation during a period of colonization. And the plight of the comfort women around the world figures squarely on this discussion. Based on authoritative studies, the Japanese Imperial Army sexually enslaved about 200,000 women during the Second World War, and Koreans comprised a majority of this figure. Consequently, the comfort women issue has become a sore spot in the diplomatic relations between Seoul and Tokyo. For their part, the Korean government provides the comfort women with monthly aid for living expenses, for nursing. Their National Assembly adopted a resolution calling for Japan to enact a legislation to compensate the comfort women. Their appellate court in Korea ruled that Japan must compensate the comfort women. Their government also allowed the comfort women statues to be erected in front of Japanese diplomatic missions, among others. So instinctively, we expect Filipino statesmen to fight for the interests of comfort women survivors as aggressively, perhaps as their South Korean counterparts, but they did not. Filipino statesmen sacrificed their cause for justice in favor of Japan. Thus, this paper problematizes why they did so, elaborating how statesmen legitimized through discourse their position on the comfort women as an issue of national interest. In essence, we will see how and why the comfort women issue did not lead to a tense relations between Manila and Tokyo, as in that between Seoul and Tokyo, and did not also lead to adequately compensating the Filipino comfort women. In the course of doing so, we will see how gender and national interests are linked. So the main claim of this study is that the gender worldviews of legislators shape the construction of national interests in such a way that their discourse privileges national and economic security to the detriment of gender issues. This claim matters because lack of gender sensitivity in foreign policy issues lead to differentiated consequences for people across the gender spectrum. In this slide, the central research question is how did the gender worldviews of senators and representatives from the 9th to the 18th Congresses permeate the construction of the comfort women issue as an issue of national interest. To answer the question, To answer the question, I looked at archival texts from the Philippine Congresses, bills, resolutions, privileged speeches, transcripts of meetings and sessions, and press releases from the 9th to the 18th Congress. And I shall now present the results. There you go. The findings. I divided the findings into 4 chapters, each responding to 4 sub-questions stemming from the main research question. And we begin with how the legislators describe the comfort women by looking at the words they use. I found 3 levels at which Filipino legislators describe the comfort women in their deliberations, and they often oscillated across these levels. Sorry, I need the slides because... Okay. First is the level of physical appearance, which was not shocking because the survivors physically attended the meetings and provided testimonies. They were described as old and frail. They were actually referred to as Lola in the hearings. And in Filipino culture, according to Dr. Benedita, an expert on Filipino family from the Department of Sociology, the elderly are treated with respect because of the belief that age is directly proportional to wisdom. And this description has 2 implications. First, it proves that the women had remained in silence for so long. Lola Rosa Henson, for example, didn't even tell her children about her ordeal because she feared that she might lose respect for her. Another reason she mentioned is that nobody dared to ask about comfort women across Philippine presidential administrations. Secondly, they were described as old for a practical reason. It was to introduce a sense of urgency on the congressional measures. Since they are old and frail, we should act now and act fast. I should add that even though they were portrayed as old and frail victims, they exercised agency because they retold their painful narratives and actively worked to prevent it from happening again to other women in other armed conflicts. The next level of description is comprised of euphemisms. First, the term comfort women is a euphemism. We put it in quotes to protest its usage because it does not adequately capture the nature of the crime. Another term was entertainer, as in the 1990s, Filipino entertainers began to come to Japan. And this term used to refer, according to studies, to Filipino women with a job in music, performance, and who did engage in prostitution. Again, these euphemisms and the use of it is an act of silencing the women because it paints a cleansed imagery that essentially removes from the picture men and other women or active perpetrators of the crime. So when we use euphemisms in such context, the violence and the messy background are actually deleted. The violence is sanitized, and when it is sanitized, it becomes acceptable and legitimate to certain audiences. Note that until today, ultranationalists in Japan insist on naming them these euphemisms to argue that the women were in the conversations voluntarily and were not forced by the government of Japan. The final level of description is cultural. The women were described as persons whose dignity was violated. Not because they were victims of any crime, but specifically because they were victims of rape. Dr. Medina observed that Filipino families put premium on women's chastity marriage is the most highly approved outlet for sexual expression in the Philippines, so sex outside the marriage is a taboo, it's dishonorable. But what's interesting in Dr. Medina's work for my work is that she found out that women's honor transcends the women themselves. Even her family's honor is at stake. This points out that women's chastity in the crime of rape is more than a matter of personal injury. It's actually a collective concern, especially in Asian countries like the Philippines. And later on, I'll describe how the seemingly personal injury of rape becomes a matter of national concern. Another important finding for now is that the conceptualization of honor by the legislators leaves some room for reparability. But they didn't agree on how to repair it. Some say it should be through the Asian Women's Fund, some say through an infrastructure mega project funded by Japan. But again, it's not really helpful because neither money nor apology can sufficiently heal their wounds. At best, these calls for mega projects are tone deaf. Note that the comfort women themselves attended the hearings as research persons in Congress, including one of the most famous, Lola Rosa Henson. They did explain the inadequacies of what Japan was offering and explain why they could not accept it. For example, the personal apology of the Prime Minister or the compensation from the Women's Fund. One reason is that these acts lack the element of official state apology from the government of Japan. Listening to their voices would make us understand what's missing in some of the legislative proposals in Congress. But why did our legislators think that these national projects were appropriate compensation for the individual comfort women? The next chapter would illustrate why. Next slide, please. This answers how the legislators linked the comfort women issue to national interest. There were three arguments made by the legislators to describe the comfort women as an issue of national interest. First, they were described not as mere sex slaves, but as military or wartime sex slaves. This contextualizes the harm done to the women. The abuses were not performed in a vacuum, but in the context of international war and a period of colonization. The rape was also described as systematic because rape is a tactic of war and a strategy for colonization. A woman, in this context, is being raped not by accident or by mere physical rape, by mere physical urge, but because of her national, religious, or ethnic identity. Naturally, the legislators describe the women as victims of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, of human rights violations. But why did the government need to fight for them as such? UP College of Law Dean Merlin Magalona, an international legal luminary, explained to Congress why. Because in international law, remember this is in the 1990s, individuals then had no personality. This is pre-ICC era. The Rome Statute only entered into force in 2002, meaning to say the comfort women had no legal standing to sue Japan in international fora since only governments then could sue other governments. Thus, the lawmakers' description of the comfort women as wartime sex slaves was actually a way to justify to the Department of Foreign Affairs that they need to fight for these women. Next slide, please. The second argument they made to link the survivors to national interest is related to the first one. They argued that the comfort women were vessels of the nation's honor. The rape done to them was to emasculate the men of the community to demoralize the local community. This confirms the argument of gender scholars like McClintock that women appeared in metaphoric roles in the conceptualization of nations. The women were mga babae natin, our women, which signals ownership. Inabuso ang mga babae natin, which practically melds the women in the nation. Not only that, the comfort women were mga ina ng bayan. They were the mothers of the nations, as described. Several implications proceed from this. First, the attack on their dignity was an attack to the nation. Second, these women as reproducers of the nation or as mothers are traditionally portrayed and socialized as self-sacrificing figures. They are to submit themselves and subsume their needs to that of the nation. The third takeaway is that these tropes are the starkest evidence that legislators were discursively linking comfort women to national interests. Hence, unsurprisingly, there were some senators who asked Japan to grant redress not only to the comfort women, but to the Filipino nation as well, through, for example, a construction of geriatric health center paid for by Japan. Next slide, please. The third argument that our legislators made is that the comfort women should be exploited in order to serve as a key to good Manila-Tokyo relations. Many of the lawmakers in the 1990s lived through the war, and their ranking members were actually They were veterans of the war, and animosity in Japan in the 1990s was prevalent. So the legislators thought, let's make this a litmus test for Japan's sincerity. If they do well on the comfort women issue, then they can be trusted, then they can occupy an honored place in the international community. Hence, the lawmakers were pushing the DFA to get tougher. But for what purpose? To get more economic assistance. This seems something that we should welcome, but when you dig deeper, it's as if the women were being pawned again to get development assistance. They were laser focused on what the Philippines could get financially, as if the survivors were being prostituted again for financial gain. Third, next slide please. Aside from looking at how Philippine legislators discursively describe the comfort women, I also looked at the changes in the congressional discourse over the last 30 years. I did so because gender in IR is critical of a static or essentialist view of identities and interests. Interests and identities change, and I found out that from 1992 to 2022, there were really significant changes in the discourse. First is the usage of the term comfort women. In the 9th Congress, the term comfort women was used to mean high-class hospitality workers and sex workers. It was used to talk about sex workers near the US bases in Subic and in Pattaya in Thailand. The meaning therefore expanded. But I argue that we should be careful in interchanging these terms as it may reify the idea that Japanese yen or the US dollar or other forms of assistance are truly needed such that it must trump other considerations like the welfare of women. Next slide please. The second change comprises of the changes in international trends, which is surprising because usually congressional discourse in the Philippine setting are impacted by local issues, not international trends. But it's different for the issue of the comfort women. In the 10th Congress, the discussion centered on the Asian Women's Fund. In the 11th Congress, the focus was on the impending Women's Tribunal of the issue to be held in December of 2000. The verdict of this tribunal was of course not legally binding, but was organized by the civil society. So this also highlights the important role of civil society in trying to resolve the issue. In fact, the Philippine Congress had to link up with civic organizations to reach the comfort women so they could testify in the hearings. Note that it was also the civil society in the Philippines that exposed the issue here. They were the first to locate the victims in the Philippine setting after hearing the ordeal of the first victim to have come out in Korea in 1980s. I think the first to have come out is Kim Ha-soon. In 12th Congress, as there were compensation bills filed right in the Japanese diet, the trend here was the filing of resolutions to express support to the Japanese debt measures. In the 13th Congress and beyond, frustration grew over the lack of real progress in steps taken previously, so Filipino lawmakers began filing bills directing the Philippine executive to provide assistance package to the survivors. Next slide, please. The third change comprises of the change in type of advocates. So as you know, in the Philippines, there are two types of representatives in the House of Representatives: district representatives and party list representatives. Previously, it was the district representatives who were the key players. They were active because many of the constituents were comfort women. There's concentration in Pampanga, in Bicol, and in Leyte. But over time, it proved to be the party list representatives who were able to sustain the fight. I argue that this is because the party list system is not bound by term limits the way district representatives are. So they can refile and refile the comfort measures time and again. Some party lists are really platform-based. I noticed, for example, that the Gabriela Women's Party was most active in this fight, and they have fought for this since their first term in 2004 until the present Congress, the 18th Congress. Next slide, please. Interestingly, something remained unchanged from 1992 to 2022, and this is the sense of the pragmatic POV of the lawmakers. No? They think that Japan's dilemma on its inability to provide compensation and apology is understandable. Because granting redress to Filipinos will open the floodgates of requests from other countries, they say. Another, granting compensation, they say, is tantamount to admitting that it is an official policy, which Japan would never do. And third, our legislators would absolve Japan because they say Japan needs to cater to its domestic audience, especially the conservatives. So there was actually some sense of resignation from the lawmakers. One even said that we have to admit that we are a small country, a realist perspective. And another, straight from the horse's mouth, said, we are more interested in Japan as an investor, a donor country, and a source of ODA. So this is a clear instance of comfort women interests being discursively pitted against other sectoral interests like national security and economic interests. From the POV of IHL, International Humanitarian Law, there are prescriptions for reparations for victims of armed conflict. You see, IHL recognizes the women are affected by armed conflict differently from men. And had our legislators listened to what the comfort women were yearning for, they'd have a better grasp of what to legislate. Next slide, please. Finally, I answered the sub-question on the implications of the comfort women discourse of Congress on Manila-Tokyo relations. Among the most crucial finding of this paper is not a surprise because we know that the comfort women issue is not resolved. But the importance of this finding lies in its ability to explain how was it not resolved. The answer is because it was relegated as a peripheral issue. How so? By discursively constructing the comfort women issue as diametrically opposed to economic issues. The FA said, if we push too hard, Japan's gonna get mad and we can't afford that because they will decrease ODA and Japanese tourists might not come. Later on, last decade, congresspersons themselves said that the silence of the government over the issue was because we needed the assistance of Japan to protect our territorial integrity as China began intruding into the West Philippine Sea. Yes, there were protests from the minority, but the legislature by and large acquiesced to these theoretical narratives. How can I say so? Because they never acted on the measures filed in the Philippine House of Representatives in the Philippine Senate. Next slide, please. Despite this big finding, congressional discourse was not in vain. For one, it facilitated interparliamentary coordination between the Philippine Congress and the Japanese Diet. It was needed because it was born out of frustration over the lack of real progress made by the DFA and the DOJ. So they took matters into their own hands. And more importantly, the lawmakers in the Philippines needed this coordination because some Japanese officials argued that international law cannot be applied in Japan domestically without domestic law. So the Philippines had to support domestic legislation in Japan by coordinating with their counterparts. Next slide, please. Finally, the discourse served, according to D. Magalona, to add moral pressure to the Japanese government. We may not have won yet in courts of arbitration, but it's important that we also win the court of public opinion. The lawmakers, especially former activists, argued that the point of congressional resolutions was not mainly to be approved, but to create noise. It was to keep the issue alive, to put pressure on both the Philippine and Japanese governments. Even our foreign ministry admitted that this important act of discursively pushing Japan to do right by the comfort women is better performed by the legislature as an independent branch of government. Yes, we still have a long way ahead, but partly because of the congressional discourse, we've come a long way already. Next slide, please. Based on these findings, I conclude that the gendered worldviews of Filipino legislators shape the construction of national interests in a manner that privileges national and economic security. The discourse on the comfort women issue proves so. Next slide, please. First, we can go by explain piece by piece. First, Filipino legislators had gendered perspectives. They made the womanhood of the survivors the linchpin of why the government should help them. We see this based on how they were described and how the comfort women were talked about. Next slide, please. Second, national interests are indeed constructed discursively, proving Udavel's claims. How so? Because other narratives are possible. They are not found in nature. There's a minority, for example, in Congress that believes that Congress is not a monolithic institution. There's a minority that provides alternative narratives, like instead of reifying Japan as a donor country, some ask for a mutually beneficial relationship because Japan needed the Philippines also and our win in the arbitration court in South China Sea to protect themselves from Chinese intrusions into Japanese territory. National interests are not innate and are influenced by different worldviews. National interests are a social construct. Next slide, please. And finally, we see the danger of gender discourse through binary oppositions and assumption of static identities, a way of thinking that feminist IR scholars reject. Lawmakers and the DFA made it appear that the relationship between the pursuit of reparations and good relations with Japan are mutually exclusive. This type of pitting against each other perceived masculine interests like economy and security on the one hand, and feminine interests like gender issues and women's rights on the other preclude creativity in policy formulation. We see how the comfort women were feminized. They were called mothers of the nation, like Filipino mothers expected to sacrifice personal goals for the family. This binary way of thinking led to privileging of economic and security interests to the detriment of women survivors of war atrocities in the Philippines. Note that the Philippines is the first Asian country to adopt a national action plan implementing the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, which calls for states to end impunity and prosecute those responsible for war crimes, including sexual and other violence against women. Yet, we're nowhere near to fully providing the adequate reparation the comfort women need. Finally, next slide please. Certain implications proceed from these conclusions. On the level of method, we see the importance of investigating these courses to foreground national interest, to foreground the point that national interests are not self-evident. By looking at the debates of our political institutions, I saw that national interests are based on narratives, and these narratives compete. Winning narratives are discursively constructed and publicly justified. On the level of theory, I know how crucial it is for gender perspective to be present in policy formulation, including foreign policy formulation. My findings suggest that lawmakers were gender blind and were thus unable to see how detrimental their feminization of the issue was. I made a personal computation in assuming a pension of 10,000 pesos per month for say 50 survivors, it would only comprise of 0.000009% of the 2025 Philippine government budget. But nobody had the guts to pass it for the fear of putting Japan in a bad light. Yet up to date, there's still a permanent committee on Veterans Affairs in the House of Representatives for their pension benefits for male veterans. But nobody's thinking it might hurt the United States or Japan. These contradictions are what the mainstream IR may fail to see. Finally, on the level of policy, the gender perspective is likewise important, and careful thought must be given on how we construct victims of armed conflict. My study also highlights the women, more women, need to be elected in Congress because it was women lawmakers who introduced to the discussion the gender perspective of war. It was women lawmakers who promoted the renunciation of war as an instrument of foreign policy. And it was women legislators who asked where the women were. Maraming salamat po. Kansahan ka.
First, sir, House of Representatives. My name is Joseph Marie Aranas from the College of Communication Development Communication Division of West Science University from PhD. So I would like to commend the scholars of political science who are also looking into how the words affect, how words are very important and powerful, and how you also analyze at the very macro level structure of how words are being used in hearings. This is very important for us. There's an intersectionality between political science and communication because the words used in hearings are amplified through our news and the media. This is maybe a very basic question, but are there any deliberate efforts to improve how the House of Representatives talk about not just comfort women, but marginalized members of our community? Or at least do they have a level of awareness of how the narratives affect sometimes the members of the community? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. For comfort women specifically, as far as the House of Representatives is concerned, and for other victims of armed conflict, no, there are no deliberate attempts to do what you just proposed. But just last year, because I draft bills, I'm a legislative staff of a member of Congress, and the Secretary of the House of Representatives issued a memorandum calling for all staff members to draft legislators with texts that are not gender biased. So, for example, we do not use, we do not use pronouns like he or she anymore. We just repeat for example, the President of the Philippines should direct so and so. And then usually in the past, for the next sentence, they would use the pronouns he must, blah blah blah, etc. But for now, just recently, just last year, the House of Representatives issued a memorandum that we should not use those funds anymore and just repeat the term president instead of using pronouns. So those are the current developments in the House of Representatives as far as gender development is concerned.
Okay, thank you. In connection to the question, I just wanted to also ask, because you showed a while ago that there are bills filed by the party list representatives. What happened to these bills, and what are the current efforts being done by these party list groups to, in fact, further amplify the advocacy related to comfort bill?
So the bill, since our legislators have filed bills since 1992. The issue came up in 1992. They first filed a resolution, not a bill. A resolution calls for an investigation of the issue. So they first filed a resolution, but they adopt a resolution calling for Japan or the Philippine government to act on these issues. There were still bills, but remember that the scheduling of hearings of bills is a political decision. So it's are we live? Because I might lose my job. So for example, the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the leadership of the House who decides which bills get tackled when. So the leadership may just simply ignore these bills and tell the
Question from the audience. Sure.
I have a question for Ms. Lamia. So because it's like 20 years already with our diplomatic relations to bodies with some Korean areas. So I was wondering if there are some marked differences within different, eras or stages throughout that 20 years. Like, is it different 10 years ago versus this last 10 years? Or is there a difference between before the pandemic or after the pandemic? If you can summarize. Thank you.
I actually did not observe any difference. I think 20 years time is quite short to observe transformations with regard to exchanges, and what I can see more pronounced what do you call this, differences can be observed not within sister cities from a particular country, but more with sister cities coming from different countries. For example, the sister city with Japan is more civil society organization driven. The sister cities with Korea are really initiated by city leaders coming from the government, and the sister cities with the United States are driven by people coming from Baguio who migrated there. But Korean sister cities differences not quite within the 20 years.
Okay, so, well, in relation to that question, I just wanted to also ask, what are the challenges faced by the LGU of Baguio City in pursuing engagements with sister cities in Korea?
What are the challenges? I think one of the more familiar challenges was the pandemic, because they had to engage with activities protecting the city itself. So the international tasks were relegated to the outside, but structurally, if we are to disregard that topic, changes in administration, leadership, because 3 years, changing leadership would affect the committees that are handling the sister city relations. And of course, like I said, it's quite related to the history of how the sister cities with Korea emerged. They're not civil society organization oriented, so there are no people to quite liaise or coordinate activities.
Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? I have one more question for Axel. Yes. Because there are currently issues about FDA in general, right? And I remember when I was working with ASEAN Korea Center, there are also issues as regards FDA utilization among ASEAN states and bilateral trade with ASEAN. And also we have this issue with U.S.-China trade. So how can countries like the Philippines and Korea avoid similar decoupling from and maximize the utilization of FTAs between the two countries? Because I understand that in the past, the issue of many ASEAN countries is the strict implementation of what do you call this one? There's a custom regulation that they have to screen the products thoroughly. For example, there were issues about the shrimp having increased level of toxicity coming from Thailand and Vietnam and other Southeast Asia. And the issue about the bananas is about the bugs that they have to also contain prior to its distribution in the market.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's really about improving our regulatory frameworks and our internal mechanisms. Regards to, for example, in the Trump administration tariffs, there were reports actually that because compared to other ASEAN countries like Vietnam and Thailand, yung bilateral tariffs natin is lower, 17% relative to others. So there's actually arguments that we could actually benefit from it. But that's if we have the right structures in place for us to benefit. So that's basically that we need to have infrastructure in place, regulatory frameworks in place for us to benefit, not just the situation regarding the Trump tariffs, but also, I just mentioned, some of the FTAs na underutilized and not for its full benefits.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience? Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you very much to our speakers for sharing their insights. So now to give the certificate of appreciation to our panel speakers. Certificate of appreciation is proudly presented to Emil Mia Damian for presenting her paper entitled Paradigmatic Realities. Taking Roots Through City Sisterhood at the 2025 Philippine-Korea Studies Symposium held at the University of the Philippines, Quezon City, signed by Director Kyung Min Bae of UPKRC. The next certificate with the same citation will be given to Axel Fitzgerald Bulawan. Okay. Last one would be a certificate of appreciation for Mr. Joshua Emmanuel Ramos. Take a picture of them.